Someone once said that a pun is the lowest form of humor. But today I can't resist, so bear with me. It's a play on a much-remembered spelling idiom from our school days. I'm sure you remember it. It's I before E, except after C. And so I dare say, there was once a young man, a Puritan from Boston to be exact, and this young man had a great deal of trouble remembering the rules of conduct in the community. He tried ever so hard, but he was constantly being ridiculed for his breaches of etiquette. In desperation, he turned to an elder, also a Puritan, to teach him some proper manners. Oh, the task was formidable, and the older man's patience grew thin and thinner and thinner, as he had to repeatedly chastise the younger man for his very awkward ways. Finally, on the way into church one Sunday morning, the younger man started into the building ahead of his mentor, and he was firmly collared by his elder, who then allowed a lady to enter ahead of both of them. The young man expressed his regret about walking in front of the older gent and lady, but his mentor had finally had enough and he lost his temper. In exasperation, he screamed at the young man, "Canst thou remember nothing?" Pointing to the woman who had just entered, he yelled, "Young man, remember, it is I before thee, except after she." Pretty bad, I admit. Sometimes it takes courage to tell things like that. But you know, with this background, this morning we come face to face with today's lesson from Matthew's Gospel. This morning, we meet Jesus amidst one of his many and familiar controversies with the Pharisees. In this moment, Jesus is turning the conventional expectations of society upon their head. For you see, the Pharisees had certain rules, not rules of hygiene and not rules of I before E except after she and all of this, no, but religious rules, rules dealing with the washing of one's hands. While most of the religious community was preoccupied with what would defile and hurt the body, Jesus made it clear that he wanted his disciples to be different. He wanted his disciples to focus on a matter of far greater importance. Jesus wanted his followers to listen and to understand that what goes into a person's mouth does not make a person unclean, but that which comes out of the mouth is that which hurts God, hurts God's world, and defiles one's very soul. In other words, that which comes out of one's mouth is a direct reflection of what is in one's heart. Think about it. Evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are the things that harm one's soul. These are the things that harm one's very being. Why? Because these are some of the things that put I before God. To be certain, Jesus knew that the Pharisees kept God's covenantal law. He also knew that the Pharisees had become spiritual nitpickers, dealing with issues of minor consequence, while deep down within themselves, and yes, even outwardly, ignoring the truly critical issues of life. But I have a feeling this didn't just happen in Jesus' time. For isn't it amazing how hung up we human beings can become over relatively minor issues? Inside the church? Oh yes. Outside the church? You better believe it. For the legalist, of course, there are no minor issues. But when I dare to think about it, if there are no minor issues, then there are no major issues either. And if there are no major issues and no minor issues, then wearing long hair becomes the spiritual equivalent of murder, and the length of a skirt takes on the essence of adultery. God forbid. Jesus undoubtedly appreciated many things about the Pharisees, but Jesus made it very, very clear that he thought that their priorities were far more than just a little bit out of kilter. Think about it. Jesus knew that the Pharisees were building religious walls that excluded people who needed God's help. As the niceties of religion were observed, the Pharisees were making their neighbors feel unimportant and unwelcome in temple. Surely the Jewish people owed a debt of gratitude to the Pharisees for much of what happened in Judaism. Much of what is best in Judaism would have been lost without the Pharisees. And to be sure, the traditions of their faith helped them maintain their identity in a very idolatrous world. But the Pharisees had gone too far, according to Jesus. To put it simply, in our morning lesson, Jesus was saying to the disciples, Jesus was saying to the Pharisees, when you build walls which cannot be climbed, when you make the washing of hands more important than building bridges between people, when you are exclusive rather than inclusive, when you choose to put yourself on a pedestal, when you make your own righteousness more important than raising the self-esteem of the poor and the hungry and the outcast, then you are putting I before God. Listen and understand, said Jesus. You are putting I before God. Storyteller Lee Pennington shares a lesson learned from an old woodcutter named Jim. Perhaps there's a Jim somewhere in all of our lives. Everyone in town knew Jim. He was the ugliest fellow in town. There were those who avoided Jim solely because of his appearance. But as children sometimes lead us, teenage Lee considered Jim a very special friend. One day, Jim challenged Lee to go out into the forest and find 2 leaves from 2 different kinds of trees, which were the exact shade of green. Gather as many leaves as you can, said Jim. And if you can find any 2 that are the exact shade of green, then I'll give you $100. And friends, that was a fortune to that young man. In fact, $10 was a fortune to the youngster. And so he set about his task with a great deal of vigor. Lee collected many different leaves, but when he laid all the leaves before Jim, Lee realized that none of them were a perfect match. As Lee pondered the unique nature of each leaf, and with Jim's help, Lee began to understand the same lesson that could be applied to all human beings. At a very young age, Lee learned to see the uniqueness of every leaf and the uniqueness of every single person he met. Perhaps this is the message that Jesus is offering to the world today. Might we just be hearing Jesus say to us this morning, sisters and brothers, listen and understand. Listen and understand that the Christian life is not about I. The Christian life is all about God. The Christian life is about getting ourselves out of God's way and making room for the unprecedented ways of God. It is about the uniqueness of all God's children. It's about transformation, the healing of wounded souls, renewed hope. It's about the shaping of decisions. It's about change. It's about inspired compassion. And it is about the binding of people one to another. Even, and yes, even more so, when we know that no two leaves are alike and no two people are alike. The Pharisees missed the point. The disciples almost missed the point. And this morning, I courageously ask you, and I ask myself, might we too, might the church today, might Christians today also sometimes miss the point? Are any among us this morning putting our personal heart's desire above what God decides is right for our lives or for God's church? Is it just possible that we need to look into our very souls and make a new beginning and turn our minds and our hearts that are beating within us, turning our all over to God? Oh, sisters and brothers, it is a choice. With urgency, with expectation, with anticipation, God is inviting each and every one of us today to put God first, no matter the cost. God is inviting us to live, to fully live as God's children in the light of God's love. And God is inviting us as a church to go forth from worship today, committed to encountering God this week, this day, in a new and wondrous way. After all, life is not really about I. Life is all about God. This is God's message for God's people today. Thanks be to God. Amen.